Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back once again to the Siege of Vraks. Last time we had a look at how the general plans for the Subterranean War was formed, and how the various areas were selected for mining operations. Now we're going to look at the operations themselves. The mining efforts are now well underway. The Death Korps engineers have cut deep into the Vraksian soil, all the way down into a third layer of near-solid rock. In this layer, they have begun to dig towards the enemy's lines. And this is where perhaps one of the greatest dangers to the engineers first began rearing its ugly head. For whilst the various natural dangers had all been accounted for as well as they could, and counters deployed, such as, for example, pumps to get rid of excess groundwater, although even then the miners often found themselves having to work in ankle-deep water. The walls were also regularly braced, and certain areas were even reinforced with permacrete. Vraks was a fairly stable planet, one of the reasons why it had been chosen as an armory world in the first place, since earthquakes and other major tectonic activity was fairly rare, but it is always good to take some precautions, and there were of course other dangers as well when it came to bracing a tunnel. For example, it would eventually collapse in under its own weight if not properly braced, especially on a planet like Vraks, where the weight above might change rather drastically from one day to another, due to the torrential downpours that constantly plagued the planet. But an entirely new and unnatural threat was now becoming more and more pressing, namely, of course, the enemy. As previously mentioned, there were many in the Auxiliary Labour Corps that had worked on the massive underground storage bunkers, and so had plentiful knowledge and experience in digging on Vraks. And it would appear as if many of them had maintained at least some sort of relationship with their old hobby, as they swiftly discovered that the Death Korps was attempting to undermine the Vraksian positions. This information must have been brought swiftly up the line, because soon thereafter, counter-mining operations were launched by the Vraksian defenders. And so began a new phase in the underground war. So far, the only thing the Death Korps engineers had to worry about were various natural hazards, all of which they were plentifully equipped to deal with. Gas masks, air tanks, filters, prefabricated bracing equipment, and permacrete fixtures. The enemy, however, was often not quite as cooperative as Mother Nature. In particular because it was so damn hard to actually find him. This, of course, held true on both sides, although the Death Korps engineers still had a small advantage in this area. The Vraksians had access to what was primarily civilian-issue low-standards equipment. They could not find the Krieg engineers anywhere near as well as the engineers could find them. The Vraksians did, however, have the advantage of knowing the ground far better than the engineers, and could utilize previously dug-out test tunnels that had been explored to see if they could be turned into further armories before Vraks turned traitor. But you may be wondering, how precisely does one find the enemy whilst underground? It's not like you can see him, it's not like you can use radar, and indeed even ground scanning equipment has some pretty serious limitations, especially when it comes to looking for small underground cavities that might include fleshy enemies. Well, the answer to that query is sound. It was a far from ideal means of locating the enemy because, of course, sound, whilst it does certainly travel underground, is not exactly particularly easy to pick up. And a large quantity of specialized equipment was used by both parties to try and locate their opposition. Again, the Death Korps had a small advantage in this area, but nowhere near enough to make them completely safe. And, of course, another problem is, when you wanted to listen for the enemy, you had to stop all of your own work, lest you deafen yourself with the sound of pickaxes right next to you. And that means that you can only listen when you are not making sound. And if the enemy already knows you are there, and they notice you stop making sound, guess what they will do? They'll assume you're listening, and they'll stop making sound as well. To put it somewhat bluntly, locating the enemy underground is exceptionally difficult, and even worse than just that, it is even harder to know if the enemy has noticed you. Which in turn means that death underground usually comes swiftly and without even the tiniest hint of warning. As for the methods most commonly used to attack the enemy's mining operations, there were two of particular importance. The first was to attempt to collapse the enemy's mines. This was usually done via directed explosives. What this means is you would essentially place a nice big fat bomb with a means of directing the blast in a certain direction, pointing towards the enemy's mining operations. Then you would block off your own mine with, for example, sandbags to ensure that the blast would not simply just reverberate down the tunnel and squish anybody unfortunate enough to still be inside of it. Then the explosive would be detonated at a safe distance, preferably from the surface, if at all possible. The resulting blast would then send a shockwave through the ground, in addition, of course, to the explosive effect itself, blowing out chunks of rock. If this was done close enough to an enemy mine, it would cause it to collapse. Worst case scenario, it would simply collapse the entire thing, burying the poor miners within. The quote-unquote best case scenario, it would only collapse parts of the mine, trapping the poor miners behind a massive wall of rock. There was, of course, the off chance that they could maybe be rescued, depending upon the scale of the collapse, but your odds were not exactly stellar. Especially for the Vraksians. Whilst the Death Korps engineers carried with them additional air tanks and gas filtration masks, which could allow them to survive for quite lengthy periods, even once trapped underground, and therefore, of course, slowly but surely wearing away at their oxygen reserves, for the Vraksians, this kind of equipment was considerably rarer, and so they had to rely purely on the air that was trapped in the collapse with them. And depending upon how many miners were inside at the time, that reserve of oxygen could disappear very rapidly indeed. In this sort of warfare, the Death Korps of Krieg also had another advantage. Whilst the Vraksians had to rely on improvised explosive charges with which to detonate the other side's mine, the engineers had access to a rather ingenious weapon, the mole launcher. As the name suggests, this marvel of technology fired a weapon capable of burrowing through solid rock via the use of a small but powerful disruptor field. The weapon could also be guided by a team of Death Korps engineers, one firing the weapon directly into the rock side and the other steering the weapon via a fly-by-wire guidance system, allowing the breaching torpedo, as it was named, to be guided directly into the enemy's positions. This also allowed the weapon to be fired from an unexpected direction. For example, the Death Korps engineer's mine could be far below the enemy's countermine, and yet, even so, the mole launcher could be fired directly into the wall and simply steered upwards towards the enemy's mining operations. The weapon itself was also equipped with a very powerful warhead, allowing it to be used as a breaching tool in many other situations. It could be used to blast a path up to the surface, for example, or annihilate a bunker's permacrete floor, for a quick and easy takeover by Death Korps engineers. This weapon obviously gave the engineers an absolutely massive advantage in the underground war, as it was easy to deploy, quick to fire, and did not require anywhere near the same amount of preparations as an improvised explosive device would. Once an enemy mine was located, a mole launcher could be brought up and fired within minutes, whilst it could easily take hours to set up an improvised charge. Although, to be honest, it rarely was quite as quick as all that. Whilst a mole launcher kept in reserve could be brought up and fired, as mentioned, within minutes, there were not all that many of these weapons. They were precious, rare, and only entrusted to the most veteran and expert of Death Korps engineers. As such, each formation only had access to a few of these miraculous weapons, and, generally speaking, they were kept well and truly to the rear, so as to not risk losing a valuable weapon and its crew to an enemy counter-mining operation, or, even worse, have it be captured by the enemy. Which brings us neatly to the second way of taking care of an enemy mine, which of course was to breach into the mine with shotguns and las pistols and clear it out the good old-fashioned way. This was of course a very, very risky operation, since you would now be fighting the enemy at point-blank range down what was in all due likelihood an extraordinarily narrow corridor. This kind of fighting was swift and exceptionally brutal, even by Vraxian standards, and was usually over in mere seconds. Whichever side had the element of surprise would be almost assured to wipe out the opposition in mere moments. Or, alternatively, get wiped out in mere moments if the enemy had heard you digging and had prepared for just such a break-in attempt with, say, a few sandbags and maybe a heavy stubber. It was a very risky tactic, and by and large both sides preferred to collapse the enemy's mining efforts, but there were of course rewards to be gained as well from a break-in effort. First and foremost, the most enticing of these rewards was the ability to swiftly break into an enemy's mine and push a considerable distance into said mine, whereupon explosive charges would be placed on enemy bracing structures, and thusly much larger sections of the enemy mine could be collapsed at once, leaving, of course, the enemy with a hell of a lot more rock and nonsense to dig through rather than if they had simply just collapsed one small portion of it. There was also the ever-enticing opportunity to maybe gain a bit of information. If a Vraxian officer could be captured, and maybe, just maybe, he had a map on him. If the enemy got a little bit careless, for example, ooh, that could be a reward beyond virtually any and all estimation. And then of course there was an even greater potential prize. A prize that Marshal Kagori was particularly interested in gaining for himself. And since Vraks of course used to be an Imperial world, he knew exactly where that prize was located. It was in Sector 554-467. And both the 12th Line Corps and the 46th Line Corps were currently advancing their own mining operations towards this location. So, what was at this highly mysterious location, you might ask? What manner of prize would be worth dedicating 2 entire Line Corps worth of Death Korps engineers to seize? The answer, of course, is the underground armories. Oh yes indeed. Marshal Arnhem Kagori had gotten sick and tired of the enemy simply just lifting Imperial equipment out from below ground and using it to murder his poor guardsmen. He was once again of the radical opinion that it would be much better if these equipment pieces could simply be taken from the enemy, or, if that was not possible, destroyed, before their weapons could be turned upon his guardsmen. The idea of destroying the armory was not in and of itself a novel one. His predecessor, Lord Commander Julka, had attempted the same thing, although relatively lazily. He had simply just ordered the 88th to shell the location in which the armories were located. And whilst there were some damned big siege guns in the 88th's arsenal, nothing quite big enough to breach a bunker that had been designed to withstand an orbital barrage. And even the Adeptus Mechanicus' marvellous drilling warheads fired from the bombard guns could reach that depth and still penetrate the underground bunker's permacrete structure. And of course, when Lord Commander Julka's first solution, beat it to death with heavy artillery shells, didn't work, he, as was his habit, simply then decided to ignore the problem until somebody else came up with a better solution. And that stalemate would continue throughout the entirety of Lord Commander Julka's command. Arnim Kagori, however, was far more determined that the armories be either seized or outright destroyed. To begin with, he attempted to do so by surprise, but the Vraksians were getting quite wise to this trick by now, and the various mines heading towards the underground bunkers were discovered, and the Cardinals' commanders, realizing what an absolute disaster it would be if they allowed the Death Korps of Krieg into their armory reserves, heavily countermined the Death Korps' efforts. And so this area swiftly became the hottest contested of all of the underground battlefields, with mines upon countermines constantly radiating out from the two front lines. Initially, the casualties underground were considerably lighter than those above ground, simply due to the fact that you couldn't fit quite as many dudes underground as you could above it. But as the war expanded and more mines were launched, bringing in yet further organizations of engineers, the war took on an entirely different nature. Soon, the Death Korps engineers were detecting new Vraksian countermines on a daily basis, and were organizing assaults against them round the clock. The mole launcher teams were being run ragged to the point of exhaustion, and even then there were several other countermines that simply were not detected, which led to the sudden attacks and collapse upon the Vraksians' own mining efforts. Skirmishes into one or the other side's mines were virtually daily occurrences. And it swiftly became very clear to everyone involved that the element of surprise had been well and truly lost. And so stealth was almost entirely abandoned in favour of speed and brute force. Whilst there would still be a few mines trying to make their way stealthily towards the armories, most of the Death Korps engineer efforts would now be spearheaded by heavy mining and drilling equipment. The introduction of these advanced drilling tools sped up the rate at which tunnels could be created and advanced by an order of magnitude, but it also meant that the enemy would always know precisely where the tunnels were. The problem was that the tunnels were advancing so rapidly that there was no way for the Vraksians to intercept them using their old and tried and proven methods. Instead, they also had to bring in their own loud mechanical drilling equipment. This shifted the focus of the underground war quite drastically. Now you had main surge mines who would leap and surge forward quickly, attempting to essentially make a break for enemy mines that had been detected to burst into them and invade their inner workings, or maybe going straight for the underground armories themselves, whilst the defenders would be doing that exact same thing, but in reverse. And simultaneously, you would also have the occasional sneaky mine, which would not be making as much noise, sneaking forward slowly under the cover of all of the other mining operations and preparing their own demolition charges and secret break-in attempts. The war underground had expanded drastically, with dozens upon dozens of drilling operations taking place at any given time, and now the war had grown to such an extent that the rate of casualties per capita was actually higher underground than above it. In no small part, this was due to the fact that whilst engagements in the underground war were still considerably rarer, those engagements tended to be, once again, exceptionally brutal and bloody, with both sides utilizing large quantities of specialized equipment, shotguns with flechette rounds, pistols, and booby traps to defend their own tunnels. And additionally, of course, came various heavy weapons, heavy stubbers and bolters, usually kept behind sandbag barricades, usually overlooking lengthy straight lines of tunnels, down which the heavy weapon could fire entirely unobstructed with devastating effect. But this means of defense was also quickly countered by the Death Korps. First and foremost, their mole launchers were able to be fired through rock, and so several could be fired at once to carpet bomb a tunnel, breaching the tunnel in several areas with multiple warheads and then detonating them all in quick succession. The Death Korps also began using gas weaponry. Nothing like the TP-3 deployed on the northern front. Instead, these were lighter, softer types of gas. The kind of stuff that the Death Korps' own gas mask and specially treated uniforms would have no problems dealing with, but that would still strain the capabilities of the mostly improvised gas filtration systems of the Vraksians. And so, slowly but surely, the Death Korps engineers continued to gain ground. Whilst above ground, the Vraksians had the advantage of their defensive positions. Here, the Death Korps were the ones on the offensive. They had superior manpower, superior expertise, and superior weaponry. And these advantages swiftly began to tell against the Vraksians, who had to abandon more and more of their mining operations, until eventually the Death Korps engineers stood ready for their first breaching attempt against the enemy's underground armories. A full 5 companies of engineers had been rerouted from other digging operations to reinforce this push. Additionally, several formations of elite grenadiers had been reassigned from their duties alongside the various mechanized and armored formations, and given specialist equipment, including melt bombs, demolition charges, shotguns, and multi-melters. But the enemy had also made their preparations. They knew what was coming, and they also full well knew the consequences of not holding the armories, and so they had depleted their already fairly thinly staffed top front lines to reinforce the underground armories, including a band of cornet berserkers. An inclusion that the Cardinal must have felt quite conflicted about. On the one hand, they could not afford to lose the underground armories. On the other hand, giving the worshippers of Khorne and their new boss, the Warlords of Four, easy access to said armories, well, that was a calculated risk, and undoubtedly it was also the reason why only one warband was allowed underground. There was also, of course, the teensy-weensy problem that the Blood God's followers tend to become somewhat erratic once their blood, if you will excuse the pun, is up. And in the deep, dank underground darkness of the subterranean war, it would on occasion be rather difficult to tell friend from foe. Not, mind you, that it's a distinction that the worshippers of the Blood God care overmuch for even in the full illumination of daylight, but still, the poor bastards who were selected to fight alongside them must all have felt somewhat like they were holding a tiger by the tail. Well, who am I kidding? A tiger would be a mild and gentle pussycat in comparison to this particular monstrosity. Undoubtedly, the various officers that were attempting to command the underground war hoped that they could point the berserkers in the general direction of the enemy and then never ever lay their eyes upon them again. And hey, at the end of the day, despite all of the inherent dangers in fighting alongside the blood-crazed maniacs, they were still, relatively speaking, a larger threat to the enemy, at least most of the time. And finally, the defenders had used the time purchased by their continued defensive mining efforts to empty the underground armory of most of what it had previously contained. That, of course, still did not mean that they could simply just surrender it, as if they did, that would leave a hole in their defenses. The Death Korps of Krieg, if they achieved control over the armory, may not be able to destroy as much equipment or capture it as they may have hoped, but they would still have gained a foothold within the Vraksian defensive lines, from which they could potentially assault other armories, and they couldn't empty them all. The Vraksian preparations would be put to the test on 80-38-25 Millennia 41. The engineers had laid out the breaching charges and were ready to punch through the walls of the armory structure. Above ground, the 150th and 471st Siege Regiments was also to launch their own offensive against the Vraksian lines, whilst the engineers would be supported indirectly by the 27th Artillery Company. Obviously, the artillery's shells could not reach all the way deep underground, but they could make any and all movements in the sector in which the combat was to take place extraordinarily hazardous, and by doing so hopefully prevent the enemy from sending further reinforcements. The honour of detonating the breaching charges went to Captain Garris of the 98th Engineer Company, who detonated both charges exactly on time, opening 2 huge breaches in the underground storage bunker of 5546. The engineers had not been at all frugal when placing the demolition charges, and the gargantuan explosions blasted huge openings in the ferrocrete construct, sending gargantuan boulders of rock flying like children's toys deep into the armories. Several squads of enemies were either outright obliterated by the blast or crushed underneath hailstorms of falling debris and rock. The blast had also been of such a magnitude that it had completely disabled the underground storage bunker's internal electrical systems, plunging the entirety of it into deep, unyielding darkness. And so the 2 first squads of engineers to enter 5546 did so with the flashlights attached to their shotguns turned on and ready. They encountered no resistance around the initial breach point. The explosion had either pulped any and all enemy resistance or buried them between tons of rubble. This peaceful state of affairs was not going to last all that long, however. Whilst the first few rooms of the gargantuan underground structure had been cleared, there were hundreds, if not thousands, more storage areas. 5546 was a huge underground complex, with dozens upon dozens of large storage rooms for the maintaining and storage of vehicles, along with hundreds upon hundreds of smaller rooms and facilities meant for the storage of small arms, ammunitions, mines, artillery shells, etc., etc. The Death Korps engineers would have to clear each and every one of them one by one. They would also have to fight their way down long, open corridors, which would almost certainly have been fortified by the enemy. And indeed, it did not take long before the engineers ran into their first serious source of resistance. Vraksian infantry dug in behind improvised defences made out of rubble, used oil barrels stuffed full with sandbags, and anything else they could get their hands on. They had set up firing positions with heavy stubbers and other heavy weaponry to hose down the long galleries and entranceways. The Death Korps engineers would have to storm these entranceways using gas or smoke grenades. Alternatively, if they could gain access to them, they could utilize further, smaller breaching charges to blast their way through the ferrocrete walls of the various storage rooms. Initially, the engineers made good progress against a shell-shocked enemy, and soon thousands of engineers were streaming in through the 2 breaches. But they quickly encountered fiercer and more determined resistance, and it soon turned into an exceptionally brutal and lethal close-quarters running gunfight. Without any of the overhead lights in function, the entire area was, as mentioned, completely dark. Both sides had little, if any, in the way of infrared, low-light equipment, and so had to rely virtually exclusively on flashlights. The Vraksians themselves had not quite accounted for this, and were even more limited than the Death Korps engineers. They, however, had the advantage of being able to simply stay put and await the enemy, and as soon as they saw a source of light around a corner, they would open fire with anything and everything they possessed. Sometimes they would fire too early, and maybe only catch the lead engineer. Other times their nerve would hold better, and they would wait for several squads to enter their line of fire before opening up. But whenever a Vraksian defensive position was located, regardless in the cost of lives to the engineers who found it, it would quite swiftly be overwhelmed. This kind of underground warfare was exactly the kind of stuff the Death Korps engineers were so well trained and equipped for. Poison gas canisters, flamethrowers, shotguns, and melter guns were used to reduce every Vraksian position one by one. They would claim a cost in engineers every time, but they would also equally swiftly be overwhelmed in turn. But, upon reaching the main galleries, progress quickly slowed. The Death Korps engineers had gained a solid foothold within the armory, but they were now assaulting the larger galleries, the huge storage depots and areas into which a squad had to charge almost single or double file into potentially dozens of enemy fortified positions. Additionally, the sheer scale of these underground structures meant it was very difficult to fill them with gas, or drain them of oxygen by using flamers. More and more reports of stalled progress began making their way back to Captain Garris of the 20th Company, who was in charge of the initial assault force. He quickly made the decision to widen the scope of the fighting, not merely just breaching charges, but also full-on melter charges would now be used to blast their way through heavier ferrocrete walls. Additionally, the usage of light forms of gas weaponry would be replaced by considerably heftier forms. No longer would the Death Korps engineers be utilizing annoyance gases. Now they would be authorized to use corrosive gas. In the same vein as TP3, these forms of heavy gases were able to eat their way through a defender's gas masks and uniform. Although nowhere near as vicious as TP3, whose deployment in these underground corridors would be little more than suicide, they would still be more than able to eat their way through the Vraksians' improvised gas masks and uniforms, whilst still allowing the Death Korps engineers to advance with a degree of safety. As long as the engineers used their experience and know-how to avoid the densest concentrations of the gas, whilst also keeping a watchful eye on their gas filters and the status of their own uniforms, they should be able to advance without suffering too much in the way of ill effects. Once again, the advance of the 20th Company picked up in speed. Galleries were being cleared and enemy defences destroyed via the liberal use of corrosive gas and melter charges with which to flank the enemy. When one gallery fell, the one next to it could then be breached in multiple areas and flanked by engineer squads. Whenever the enemy fell back and attempted to weld entrances shut behind them, even the thickest steel doors were swiftly breached by additional melter charges. Captain Garris himself was leading several squads of engineers deep into the enemy underground structure, when they ran into just one such an impediment. Swiftly, melter charges were placed against the reinforced steel barricade, and the squad retreated to a safe distance, detonated the charges, and then continued on. Captain Garris was the first man through the still molten and practically dripping breach when the man behind him was suddenly sprayed with some sort of warm liquid all over him. Captain Garris had practically disappeared in a welter of blood and innards, and in front of the company's second man, illuminated in the light of his shotgun's flashlight, stood a huge red armoured figure. The sergeant barely had time enough to pull the trigger of his shotgun once and see the flèche rounds of his shotgun, designed to deal with softer targets, ricochet harmlessly off the monster's power armor before he too was dealt a mortal blow by a chain axe. The band of cornered berserkers quickly broke into the tunnel and slaughtered the rest of the advanced elements of the 20th Company. Then they were loose behind the Death Korps engineers' lines, running around madly in small bands or even as individual warriors, leaping barricades and storming through any and all firepower the 20th Company could put up to try and protect themselves. And in the complete darkness of the underground armories, the Chaos Space Marines, with their vastly superior helmet sensors, along with heightened sensors, had an utterly overwhelming advantage over the Death Korps engineers. It didn't help either that virtually the only effective weapon the engineers had against these brute monstrosities were their melter guns, which had been scattered throughout the company primarily to deal with enemy barricades. And even then, a melter gunner would have to react rapidly indeed to bring his weapon to bear against the charging monster, and also hope that his line of fire would be free, which was not at all a guarantee in the tight, winding, narrow corridors of the underground armory. And now, with yet new sources of resistance to their front, and cornered berserkers running wild behind and inside of their own captured territory, the 20th Company's advance ground once again to a complete halt. The second-in-command ordered the various engineering formations to hold what ground they could, and instead attempt to repel the cornered berserkers, in the hope that if the rear lines could be reclaimed, the push could be resumed. Unfortunately, due in no small part to their lack of suitable weaponry, this was not feasible. The engineers spent the rest of the day desperately holding out and in many cases being overran by the cornered berserkers. The next day, the 20th Company was pulled out and replaced by Death Korps Grenadiers. The sight that met them must have been an exceptionally unpleasant one. Corridors practically painted in the blood and viscera of their comrades, and with frighteningly few Chaos Space Marine corpses to show where their fellow Death Korps specialists had made effective resistance. It was hoped that the heavier weaponry carried by the Grenadiers, in addition to their hell guns, would be able to overcome the enemy's advantage in terms of armor. They could do little, however, to counter their enemy's superiority in terms of sensors. Even deploying flashbang grenades in the darkness in the hope of blinding the madman proved utterly unhelpful. The cornered berserkers possessed all of the various enhancements that made the Adeptus Astartes such a frightening fighting force, and something like a flashbang was simply not enough to overwhelm their ocular implants. Furthermore, whilst the Grenadiers' additional weaponry in the form of plasma guns, additional melter guns, flamers, and of course their very own hell guns did prove more effective against the Chaos Berserkers, it was not by much. The narrow confines of the underground armories worked against the Death Korps of Krieg. Usually, standard Grenadier protocol for facing down Chaos Space Marines is to form into de facto firing lines, and essentially try to overcome their enemy's superior protection by throwing so much in the way of firepower against him that the sheer weight of fire will slow him down until a lucky bolt can find a weakness in the enemy's armor. In the narrow underground corridors, however, this was very rarely a feasible strategy, and whilst the additional special weapons did provide some offensive advantages and did increase the rate at which Chaos Space Marines were killed, it was still nowhere near enough to secure the rear line areas. On the third day, another attempt was made by a further engineering company, who moved in with yet more specialized equipment, but once again the very terrain worked against them, and they simply could not identify and react to the advance of a cornered berserker quickly enough to bring their weaponry to bear. The Death Korps engineers were trading dozens upon dozens upon dozens of valuable specialists for every single Chaos Space Marine felled, and even worse, the enemy had prepared to cut their lines of reinforcements. Knowing that a breakthrough was inevitable, the Vraksians had waited to see precisely where it would happen, and once they were sure of where the Death Korps had broken in, they had begun counter-mining operations aimed towards the tunnels. On the third day, they were in position to detonate counter-mines, collapsing one of the mines leading into the armory. This suddenly cut the flow of reinforcements in half, as mining efforts had to be resumed to open the second tunnel. Additionally, further guards and listening posts would have to be established, but with the continuous artillery barrage above ground, locating the enemy was harder than ever. With the success of their counter-mining operation, the Vraksians also began their own counterattack. Not only cornered berserkers, but also regular Vraksian infantry, now reinforced and equipped with specialized weaponry, along of course with flashlights. The Death Korps engineers soon found themselves under continuously mounting pressure, and calls for reinforcements grew ever louder. Efforts to reopen the second tunnel, however, was cut drastically and bloodily short, as the Vraksians detonated a second counter-mine, causing a yet further and more large-scale collapse of the second mine, in addition to wiping out the engineering crews that had been attempting to reopen it. The decision was now made from higher up to cancel the offensive against the underground armories. The potential reward of ceasing 55-46 was deemed to be insufficient when compared to the risk of having the only retreat route for the remaining engineers cut off. That could potentially lead to the loss of an entire company of engineers along with grenadier forces. And the 88th simply could not afford to lose so many valuable specialists in one fell swoop. And so, on the fourth day, the companies began to pull out. The action was still thick and heavy, with various companies leaving rearguard actions to counteract the enemy's resumed offensive. They also left behind countless booby traps and gas mines to surprise the enemy, who would undoubtedly be following them as swiftly as possible, and in the pitch-dark corridors, they would make easy prey for the traps. The remaining companies were all successfully evacuated and returned to the surface. The mines were all comprehensively blown and destroyed, so as to deny the enemy any opportunity to reclaim them and use them to launch raids upon the Death Korps lines. The engineers felt that this was a failure on behalf of the upper command structures. They took this as very much so a personal insult, a slight against their honour practically. Imperial High Command had, in their opinion, been too skittish. They had been afraid of further casualties and to see the engineers cut off. As far as the engineers were concerned, that meant that High Command had valued their lives above victory. A near inexcusable breach of the cult of sacrifice, and the engineers involved must certainly have been quite frustrated with the order to withdraw, and they all swore oaths of vengeance against the Vraksian defenders and against Armoury 55-46. The simple fact that Marshal Kagori and Imperial High Command was exempt from that oath shows that the Death Korps as a whole, including the engineers, had, despite some initial reluctance, come to quite value the Marshal. He had, after all, given them victory over the third defensive line and brought them closer to an end to the war than anyone else. And above all, the Death Korps values victory. And if Marshal Kagori could give them that victory, then, well, his skittishness aside, they were clearly willing to tolerate him. And perhaps that might have something to do with the fact that the good Marshal was not done quite yet. He had another plan in the offing, and that too would heavily star the Death Korps engineers. The various companies would gather themselves up, reinforce and prepare for yet another effort. The 20th Company had been reduced to a third of its size. The Grenadiers and other companies that had been sent into the fight were also, if they were lucky, half strength or slightly above it. But the next effort in Sector 57-44 would require all of their attention, and if it was pulled off successfully, then the cult of sacrifice would certainly be more than satisfied. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Until then, have a good day.